The desert is quiet, too quiet. Behind barbed fences and armed gates lies Area 51, a place the world is never meant to see. Whispers speak of experiments that defy nature, creatures that shouldn't exist, and secrets so dark they could cost lives. Tonight, we cross into forbidden territory, uncovering America's deadliest secrets hidden in plain sight. Every shadow, every echo, every locked door holds a story of terror. Brace yourself, because once you glimpse what's inside, the nightmare doesn't end at the screen. This is Area 51, and it's far more horrifying than you could imagine. The desert waits in silence, but not the kind of silence that comforts. It presses down on you, heavy and expectant, as if it knows your secrets before you do. The wind cuts across the barren landscape, carrying whispers that sound almost human, fleeting murmurs that vanish the moment you try to focus. Nothing moves, yet the feeling of being watched is relentless. Every shadow is longer than it should be. Every rock and dune seems poised to shift. A small sign flickers in the setting sun. Warning: deadly force authorized. It is meant to warn trespassers, but it is only the beginning. Beyond this line lies Groom Lake, known to the few who know it as Area 51, a name whispered in fear, fascination, and conspiracy. To the untrained eye, it is a flat expanse of desert and dry salt beds. To those who know, it is a fortress of secrets, a laboratory of nightmares. Bob Lazar once claimed he crossed that line decades ago. He spoke of a facility carved into the mountains, a hidden world where physics itself seemed to bend. Inside, he said, were 9 alien spacecraft, silent and gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights, their designs impossible, their movements defying gravity and reason. Engineers and scientists, some real, some imagined, worked feverishly to unlock their secrets, translating incomprehensible technology into human terms. On the outer perimeter, the camouflage men made themselves known. They did not move like ordinary soldiers. They seemed to appear and disappear with the wind, merging into the hills or dissolving into shadows. Vehicles would crawl along the dirt roads, headlights piercing the darkness, but never long enough to reveal more than a hint of what they protected. Travelers who lingered too long reported strange lights, brilliant flashes, silent streaks that darted and hovered impossibly fast, exactly where Lazar said they would appear. At night, the desert transformed. The stars shone with cruel clarity, mirrored by the silent lights skimming the horizon. The air seemed to vibrate with the energy of unseen machinery, a resonance that set teeth on edge and made hearts pound. Locals called it the Watcher's Sky, and in the deepest shadows of this wilderness, something waited. Not a person, not a machine, but a presence that defied logic, testing the boundaries of belief, daring anyone to step closer. Those brave or foolish enough to approach the fence often did not return unchanged. They spoke of unease that lingered for weeks, of dreams where they saw impossible craft twisting above the desert, and felt the gaze of eyes that were not human. For those who believed, the desert was alive with secrets. For those who did not, it was simply empty. But emptiness is a lie. Something waits beyond the edge of the desert. Something that does not forgive curiosity. And tonight, it is watching. Night had stretched over the desert like a black shroud, and the silence was broken only by the occasional scuttle of a lizard or the whisper of wind over sand. At the edge of the fence, a lone figure crouched, flashlight trembling in hand. The desert stretched before him, an endless expanse that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but curiosity, that most dangerous human trait, held him rooted in place. Then it appeared, a faint glow hovering just above the horizon, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was too precise, too deliberate to be a star, too steady to be a distant campfire. The light moved with a strange intelligence, darting sideways, stopping abruptly, then surging upward. The figure froze, caught between awe and terror, as the glow split into multiple points, forming geometrical patterns that no human aircraft could ever achieve. The desert air thickened, as if the wind itself had been replaced by some alien presence. A low hum began to vibrate through the ground, subtle at first, then insistent. resonating through bones and teeth. The figure stumbled back, tripping over dry brush, but the light followed, maintaining a perfect distance, never revealing its source, yet never leaving his field of vision. A shadow detached itself from the darkness behind the fence. It moved silently, humanoid but wrong limbs too long, movements too fluid. The figure's breath caught. He wanted to scream, but the desert seemed to swallow sound, and even his heartbeat roared in his ears. The shadow paused, tilted its head, and the light surged brighter, forcing him to shield his eyes. Images flashed in his mind, gleaming silver surfaces, machines with no seams, symbols that burned themselves into memory. He fell to the ground, trembling, unable to tear his gaze from the impossible geometry hovering above. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving only the cruel, empty stars and the vast, silent desert. But he knew. It had been watching, waiting, learning. The desert had revealed its first secret to him, and in doing so, marked him forever. Even as he ran blindly back toward the safety of the paved highway, the memory of that impossible light seared into his mind. He would not sleep that night. He would not rest. Something had crossed the line from the unknown to the undeniable, and now the desert was alive with it. Something waits beyond the fence. Something that will not forgive mistakes, curiosity, or hesitation. And tonight, it has taken notice. Dawn crept over the desert, pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself feared what had stirred in the night. The figure from yesterday, shaken but unwilling to stay silent, returned this time with two friends who had insisted on seeing the strange lights for themselves. They parked a dusty Jeep near the fence, the engine's hum swallowed by the vast emptiness. The air was brittle, charged with a quiet tension that seemed to cling to their skin. They crossed the dirt road, crunching over gravel and sand, toward the perimeter signs that warned of deadly force. The warnings felt hollow in daylight, almost comical, yet every step forward tightened the knot in their stomachs. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly, and the first warning came not in words or sounds, but in a movement subtle, swift, and alien. From a distant hill, figures watched them. Camouflage, faceless helmets, binoculars reflecting sunlight. They did not wave. They did not speak. They were the watchers. The three friends froze, caught in the silent gaze of men who might not even be human, who might belong to the secrets lurking just beyond the fence. A hum began to build, faint at first, then vibrating through the Jeep's tires, rattling loose gravel beneath their feet. Their flashlights were useless in the growing brilliance of a sudden, pulsing light above the base. It moved like a living thing, stopping and shifting impossibly fast, darting sideways, twisting in angles that made the mind ache to comprehend. Then the shadows moved. Not the watchers, but something else. Long, spindly shapes slipping between the desert brush, glinting metal or scales catching the rising sun. They were gone when anyone blinked, leaving only faint, scorching traces in the sand and an unnatural chill that crawled over their skin. Fear became motion. The three turned toward their Jeep, hearts hammering, but the glow surged again, splitting into multiple lights. The watchers on the hill did nothing. The desert was alive with impossible geometry, humming with intent, and the fence, just a simple cattle barrier, felt like the edge of the world. One of the friends reached for a camera, hands shaking, but before the shutter could click, a flash of light blinded them. A voice, not spoken, but implanted, vibrating inside their skulls, whispered, "Do not follow." The lights vanished. The shadows disappeared. The watchers melted back into the hills. The desert was empty again, silent but for the ragged breaths of the three friends. They fled, dust rising in clouds behind them, knowing with certainty that what had revealed itself once could reveal itself again. And it would. The perimeter had claimed their curiosity. The watchers had marked them. The desert, endless and patient, had begun its slow, unyielding work. Something waits beyond the fence, and it will not forget. Even after they left the desert, the strange events refused to stay behind. The three friends returned to the nearest town, hearts still hammering from the previous night, yet each step along the asphalt felt heavier, as if invisible eyes trailed them. The air seemed thick, carrying the faint metallic tang they remembered from the perimeter, a smell that belonged neither to machines nor Earth. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin, an unrelenting reminder that the desert had not released them. That night, sleep was impossible. Each of them tossed in their beds, ears straining for the hum, the impossible wings slicing the sky, the silent watchers with their faceless helmets. Their dreams were invaded by phosphorescent lights, crawling across ceilings and walls, darting in ways no human eye could follow. Shadows coiled and stretched, whispering in a language just out of comprehension. The voice from the desert repeated in their minds, "Do not follow." By morning, the line between reality and memory blurred. One friend awoke to find strange footprints circling his bed, shallow depressions in the carpet that led nowhere. Another found tiny metallic shards embedded in the soles of her shoes, as if the desert had sent emissaries to mark her passage. Their phones, inexplicably, carried photos and videos none of them remembered taking. Flashes of light, glints of unknown shapes, and dark figures hovering at the edges of frames. Each image was unnerving in its familiarity, like watching themselves from a place just beyond perception. Attempts to rationalize the events failed. Local authorities dismissed their claims, but the dismissals carried an undertone of unease, as if even those sworn to ignore had glimpsed something beyond comprehension. Friends and family offered concern, but also disbelief. Conversations became riddled with tension, as every reflection, every shadow, seemed to twitch with unnatural intent. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of sunlit hour that should feel mundane, yet the sound at the door was deafening in its silence. They answered to nothing, only a folded envelope lying on the welcome mat. Inside, a single photograph, the three of them, standing at the desert perimeter, the same night they had fled, yet taken from a vantage point that could only exist inside the base itself. No signature, no explanation, just a warning in faint, scrawled letters across the back. "We saw you." Panic became paranoia. They tried to separate. Each thinking distance might break the hold, but the desert followed. Strange lights danced along highways late at night, mimicking the impossible angles they had witnessed. Shadows lingered in mirrors a fraction too long, and every low hum or vibration in the walls carried a weight of intent, as if unseen machinery or unseen eyes were tracking their every move. They realized, slowly and in terror, that the watchers on the hill had not been human, or at least, not entirely so. Their message was clear. Curiosity had been noted. Observation had become ownership, and no matter how far they ran, how many lights they ignored, or roads they avoided, the desert and its guardians would always find them. The line between myth and reality blurred completely that night. The perimeter was no longer just a place on a map. It was inside their minds, inside their homes, an invisible fence that stretched across miles, following, watching, waiting. And the desert was patient. It knew they could not outrun it, not in body, not in spirit. Some secrets, they realized, are not kept in hangars or behind fences. Some live in the air you breathe, the shadow you cannot outrun, the light you cannot see. And the desert had them now. The warning in the photograph didn't stop them. If anything, it intensified a compulsion they could not explain. Each night, they felt it, the tug of the desert, a subtle vibration beneath their feet, like the ground itself was breathing, calling them back. Dreams of phosphorescent lights and spinning metallic shapes consumed their sleep. The hum returned, low and insistent, threading itself through their skulls, whispering secrets that made no sense but demanded obedience. By the third week, the pull became unbearable. One by one, they found themselves driving into the Nevada desert under the cover of darkness. They claimed they weren't aware of the roads they took, how they ended up on empty dirt tracks stretching toward Groom Lake. The desert seemed to open beneath them, guiding, shaping their paths, as though the earth itself conspired with the unseen watchers. They arrived at the perimeter without realizing the distance they had traveled. The same cattle fence stood before them, orange and white signs catching the moonlight. But now, the lights along the hills shimmered differently, hovering, moving in patterns that no human vehicle could follow. They froze, hearts hammering, sensing the watchers. Not men, not guards. Something else, entirely. Shapes that defy definition, cloaked in the night, observing without blinking. A sudden flash illuminated the dirt road. They thought it was a flashlight, but no one appeared. The light pulsed, revealing fleeting glimpses of the perimeter. The fence, the barren hills, a dark silhouette perched atop a distant ridge, impossibly still. And then another sound, deep and resonant, vibrating through the soles of their shoes, their teeth, their rib cages. It was a hum, yes, but also something else, a wordless message embedded in frequencies they could not consciously hear. Return, fear twisted into compulsion. Despite every instinct screaming to leave, they crossed the fence. Their boots crunched against gravel, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the vast, empty desert. Behind them, the watchers remained, silent, invisible, yet palpably present. Inside the perimeter, the desert became alien. The air shimmered with heat that wasn't there, bending light, warping distance. Objects they had seen in dreams flickered at the edges of their vision, flying discs hovering impossibly still, glinting surfaces reflecting starlight in angles that shouldn't exist. The ground beneath them pulsed subtly, alive. Every instinct screamed this was not their world. Then came the sound of machinery, or perhaps it was the earth itself, pulsing and whirring, growing louder with every step. Shadows shifted unnaturally, not cast by anything visible. And at the heart of it, a light, brilliant and pure, spun in place, drawing them in. The same light they had glimpsed in the skies, the one that had defied physics, danced silently in the desert night. It beckoned. And as they approached, the air around them thickened, vibrating with a strange, almost tangible tension. Something ancient and deliberate was watching, judging, waiting. Every nerve in their bodies screamed to flee, yet their feet moved forward, their minds filled with impossible calculations, visions of technology and alien geometry, things human thought was not meant to comprehend. The desert was alive, and now it had them. The desert air seemed to thicken as they ventured deeper, each step weighed with anticipation and dread. The spinning light had vanished, leaving only a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Their boots crunched on the cracked earth, but the sound was swallowed almost immediately, as if the desert itself consumed it. Every shadow stretched unnaturally, crawling across the ground with a life of its own, twisting and pulsing in rhythm with the hum. Then they saw them. Machines, or at least things shaped like machines, lined the perimeter ahead. They were enormous, dark silhouettes with smooth surfaces that reflected the faint starlight in impossible ways. The shapes seemed aerodynamic, yet utterly alien, angular yet fluid, as if they were living constructs forged from some unearthly metal. They did not move as machines should. Instead, they hovered slightly above the ground, defying gravity, vibrating with a frequency that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. A soft hiss broke the silence, subtle at first, then growing into a steady, rhythmic exhalation. The friends froze, hearts pounding, as panels on the hovering machine slowly shifted. No sound of motors, no mechanical whine, just movement that suggested thought rather than mechanics. The air itself seemed to bend around them, warping the stars, the moon, the horizon, until nothing was certain except the dread that pooled in their chests. One of them, Mark whispered, barely audible. "They're watching us." The others nodded, unable to speak. The hum in the desert had deepened into a low vibration, a tactile force pressing against their bones. The machines emitted no light, no signal, but a presence, something ancient and precise. The desert itself seemed complicit, bending subtly around the shapes, guiding them, herding them like prey. Then, without warning, a panel on the nearest craft opened. A geometric shape emerged, hovering silently, a small probe, its surfaces gleaming like liquid silver. It rotated slowly, examining, recording. They felt its gaze not with their eyes, but with their minds. A cold, analytical intelligence probed their thoughts, calculating, cataloging, determining. Panic set in. Every instinct screamed to run, yet their feet were rooted to the ground. The probe extended a tendril-like appendage, glowing faintly, and touched the air between them. The moment it did, reality seemed to distort. The desert floor rippled like water, the distant hills bent, and the stars above flickered in patterns that made no sense. A vision of impossible geometry planes folding into themselves, corridors of light bending through infinite space flooded their minds. A voice, not human, not audible, filled their heads. Leave, or remain forever. Fear erupted. They stumbled backward, tripping over rocks, hearing the hum spike into a high-pitched scream that rattled their skulls. The probe recoiled, vanishing into the night, and the machine slowly rose, dissolving into darkness, leaving only the empty desert and the echoing hum fading into silence. Their breaths came in ragged gasps. Every nerve was frayed, every thought on edge. They had glimpsed something impossible, something beyond comprehension. The machines had not attacked, but their presence was enough. Enough to shatter certainty, to implant the unshakable truth that some things in the desert were not meant to be understood. The perimeter had claimed its warning, and they had survived, barely. The desert was silent now, but it carried a weight that pressed on their minds, heavy and insistent. Each step they took away from the machines felt slower, as though the earth itself resisted their movement. Shadows no longer belonged to the terrain they twisted unnaturally, brushing against their ankles, curling around, rocks, stretching toward them like living fingers. Every gust of wind carried faint murmurs, unintelligible words that seemed to scrape the edges of consciousness. Mark stumbled, nearly falling, as the whispers grew louder, coalescing into phrases, not spoken aloud, but known. Their meanings hovered just beyond comprehension. Promises, warnings, commands that made their skulls ache to hear. The desert was alive, not with creatures, but with awareness. I think it knows we saw them, Mark whispered, voice trembling. His eyes darted over the barren horizon, trying to pierce the darkness. The others felt it too, a sensation of being watched, judged, catalogued by something vast and incomprehensible. The air itself seemed to pulse, vibrating with intent. A faint glow appeared on the horizon, impossibly far yet unnervingly bright. The friends froze. It wasn't a campfire, not even a distant vehicle. The light shimmered, bending around itself, like liquid crystal suspended in the air. It pulsed in a rhythm that matched the hum they'd felt near the machines, an unrelenting heartbeat that made their bones resonate. As they approached cautiously, the desert whispered louder. Words formed clearly in their minds. Return. Do not follow. A shiver ran down their spines. The light now seemed to watch them, shifting subtly with their movements, always maintaining its eerie distance. Then the ground beneath them vibrated, subtly at first, then in waves that shook the soles of their feet. Dust rose in spirals around their boots, forming shapes that looked almost humanoid before collapsing back into nothing. Reality felt thin, like fabric stretched too tightly. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet curiosity, fear, tangled with fascination, kept them moving forward. Suddenly, the hum spiked into a deafening roar, and a shadow shot across the horizon. It was massive, too fast for comprehension, and it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The desert seemed to exhale, and the whispers became a single word, clear and final. Leave. Panic ignited. They ran without direction, the light receding as if guiding them, the shadows twisting and stretching to follow. Sand burned under their feet, the night air thick and choking. When they finally broke through a ridge and collapsed, hearts pounding and lungs burning, the desert fell utterly silent once more. Yet the memory remained: the hum, the light, the whispering intelligence lurking just beyond perception. They understood, in a way words could never convey. The desert was a guardian, and they had trespassed too far. What they had seen could not be shared. And some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. When they returned to town, the sun felt unnatural, too bright, too harsh, as if it were trying to burn away the memory of the desert. Mark, Lena, and Carlos moved silently through the streets, their eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The townsfolk seemed oblivious, busy with trivial concerns. But to the trio, the world had changed. The desert had whispered its secrets, and now every corner, every whisper of wind in the trees seemed charged with unseen presence. That night, sleep was impossible. The desert's hum had followed them home, an undercurrent beneath the sound of their beating hearts. Shadows in their apartments stretched in ways that defied the angle of the streetlights. Objects they had left untouched shifted slightly when they weren't looking, small things, easily dismissed, but enough to gnaw at their sanity. Lena woke first, gasping, drenched in sweat. The whispers were there again, faint but unmistakable, threading through the walls like ghostly veins. "Mark, Carlos, wake up," she urged, voice trembling. They sat upright, listening, as the air thickened with a presence neither living nor dead. It was patient, observing, waiting. They tried to speak of it during the day, but the words felt hollow. Their memories of the desert bent at the edges, like water distorting a reflection. The images refused to stay still, glimpses of light bending impossibly, shadows crawling, the feeling of countless eyes burning through the darkness. Even the simplest objects, their phones, kitchen appliances, mirrors, seemed infused with something foreign. The desert had left a mark, a scar on reality itself. Then the dreams began. Not dreams in the ordinary sense, but visions. They walked the desert again. Yet it was different this time, wider, darker, filled with impossible geometry. Monolithic shadows loomed in the distance, and the whispering grew into language, a chant that threaded directly into their thoughts. They felt themselves being studied, measured, as though their very essence were being weighed against some cosmic ledger. Mark tried recording the sounds. Lena took photographs. Carlos scribbled frantic notes, but every attempt to capture the phenomenon failed. The recordings were silent, the images blank, the notes incoherent. The desert, it seemed, had rules beyond human comprehension. What it allowed them to see was ephemeral, meant to haunt rather than to be shared. By the third week, reality outside their apartments began to fracture. They saw figures in reflective surfaces where none existed, fleeting shapes in peripheral vision, and lights that moved against the laws of physics. Friends noticed their withdrawn, hollow eyes, but when asked, they could only murmur something about the desert, their words vague, terrifyingly unconvincing. The desert had not only followed them, it had attached itself, threading into their consciousness, reshaping the world into a landscape of fear and awe. And in the quiet moments, when the wind was still and the night was thick, they could hear the whispering again, closer now, directly in their minds. You saw what should not be seen. Remember, and fear. Some knowledge is a burden, and some places should never be visited. They had trespassed. And now the echoes of the desert would follow them forever. By the time the fourth week rolled around, Mark, Lena, and Carlos had begun to feel the suffocating weight of unseen eyes pressing from every direction. The city that had once felt familiar now seemed alien. Every alleyway a potential corridor for the desert's intrusion. Every window a frame for something waiting. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, thick and black, resisting the light. The whispers had grown louder, forming fragments of words, hints of warnings, impossible instructions that burrowed into their minds. They tried to leave, to escape the city itself, but the feeling of pursuit intensified with every mile. Cars slowed near them, strangers lingered in doorways, and reflections in shop windows revealed figures that weren't there moments before. The trio realized that the desert had taught them a new language, a language of dread, and it had attached a translator to their consciousness, themselves. Sleep became a distant memory. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with visions of the desert reborn in impossible dimensions. Mountains floated, shadows moved counter to gravity, and lights twisted into geometries that made the mind recoil. Each dream ended with a single, penetrating thought. We are not alone. We are never alone. Desperation drove them to record every phenomenon, to capture proof of the impossible. Cameras failed, phones glitched, notebooks bled ink where nothing had been written. Each attempt to document the unseen resulted in a more tangible sense of intrusion. The desert was no longer a place they realized it was a presence, patient and intelligent, learning them, studying them, shaping them. Their apartment walls became the first clear sign. At first it was subtle. Scratches along the baseboards, tiny flecks of dirt shifting into patterns. Then the walls began to hum, a low vibrating resonance that thrummed in sync with their pulses. The hum carried shapes within it, eyes that blinked, mouths that whispered, and figures that stretched and recoiled in the corner of perception. Carlos swore he saw a silhouette materialize behind the glass of his bedroom window, perfectly still, staring. Lena heard her name spoken clearly through the vent, the syllables curling into the air like smoke. Mark touched the walls and felt ridges where none should exist, as if the plaster had grown veins overnight, pumping something unseen through the house. Isolation became their only refuge. Friends called, but conversations were strained. No one could understand what they were experiencing. Rational explanations failed under the weight of constant anomalies. They began marking time on calendars, but each day seemed to loop back on itself. Even the sunlight betrayed them, streaming through the windows at angles that defied logic, stretching shadows like fingers. And then came the first night of full contact. They awoke to a room saturated in blackness, yet every object glowed faintly, outlined in a ghostly light. The whispers had become voices, distinct and layered, speaking in a language that was both alien and hauntingly familiar. They moved through the room, hovering over them, watching, waiting for a reaction. And when Mark dared to speak, the voices answered, not in words, but in the tremor of fear that coursed through his bones. It was clear now. The desert was no longer a place they had visited. It was inside them, around them, and beyond them. Escape was no longer physical. It required understanding the rules of a world that should not exist, a world that had bled into theirs, and a truth that might destroy them if fully comprehended. The watchers were in the walls, in the air, and in the corners of their minds. And they were patient. By dawn, the apartment no longer resembled a home. The walls, once plain, had shifted into a grotesque mimicry of desert terrain. Sand dunes rippled along the ceilings. Shadows stretched like gnarled roots, and the air carried a fine grit that smelled faintly of ozone and decay. Mark, Lena, and Carlos realized with sinking horror that the desert had not only followed them, it had invaded their reality. The hum of the walls had grown into a rhythm that synced with their heartbeats. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was vibration, a physical pulse that seemed to rearrange molecules as it passed through the room. Objects drifted, hovering midair, their edges blurring and flickering, as if reality itself had become fluid. Every step the trio took met with invisible resistance, like moving through water thicker than air. Carlos was the first to see it clearly. A figure coalesced from shadow and light near the corner of the living room. Its limbs bent impossibly, folding over themselves, and its head rotated without neck, eyes shining like fractured glass. The air around it shimmered, and the voices that had whispered through vents now erupted as a chorus, a discordant symphony that pushed against the limits of hearing. Lena screamed, clutching her ears, but the sound did nothing. The entity moved closer, folding space between them, and the trio felt their very thoughts being scanned, twisted, and echoed back in fractured, terrifying visions. They saw versions of themselves, split and multiplied, trapped in endless loops of fear and despair. The desert was not merely outside. It was an intelligence, learning from them, preying on them, reshaping reality around their fear. Mark remembered the journals he had kept, the failed recordings, the smudged notes, the impossible photographs. None of it mattered. Reality itself had become the document, and every thought they held was ink on its shifting pages. He realized the desert had rules, but they were unknowable, and every attempt to impose logic only accelerated the collapse of their familiar world. Desperate, they formed a plan to leave the apartment together and confront the breach directly. As they stepped into the hall, the floor warped beneath their feet, the walls bending inwards like the hull of a ship caught in a storm. The voices coalesced into words, repeating a single, horrifying command: remain, observe, Submit. Lena stumbled, her vision flickering, and glimpsed something far beyond comprehension. An endless expanse of desert, simultaneously distant and immediately present, where figures moved against impossible geometry, and the sky rippled with light that defied physics. Their city, their lives, even their bodies seemed inconsequential in the vastness of what had emerged. Carlos, shaking, shouted for them to run, but the floor dissolved beneath him, revealing a hollow void that seemed to swallow sound. He fell, but instead of hitting the ground, he floated, suspended in the haze between dimensions. Mark and Lena reached for him, hands touching the intangible, and the desert reacted with a violent pulse, throwing them all back into the apartment with the force of a tidal wave. The lights snapped on familiar, normal, but nothing felt real. They were alive, yet fundamentally changed, aware that the breach had marked them. The desert had not simply invaded, it had rewritten the boundaries of what they could perceive, leaving them with a permanent echo of its presence. And in the corners of their vision, always just out of reach, the Watchers remained, patient and eternal. The morning after the breach, the city seemed unchanged, yet everything was wrong. Streetlights flickered in rhythm with the pulse that had haunted their apartment, and shadows moved with subtle autonomy, stretching toward them like searching fingers. Mark, Lena, and Carlos felt it immediately. The desert had followed, its presence embedded in the air, in the concrete, in the soundless vibration of the streets. Every step outside was weighted, as if the ground itself remembered the breach and now conspired to trap them. Cars stalled at intersections without explanation, their engines whining, tires spinning as if the asphalt beneath them had liquefied. A dry wind whispered through alleyways, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of sand and ozone. It was impossible to ignore. People on the street passed by, but their eyes were blank, reflecting nothing, faces like mirrors to some unseen landscape. The trio realized with dawning horror that the desert's reach had begun to infiltrate minds, bending perception and blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Lena clutched Mark's arm. "We need to document this," she whispered. Her camera, once a simple recorder, now distorted images before their eyes. The streets warping, the sky undulating with impossible ripples. Carlos tried to speak, but his words echoed in his own ears, twisted into unfamiliar tones, as if the desert was rewriting language itself. At the city outskirts, a vast stretch of cracked earth appeared overnight. It shimmered like glass under the weak morning sun, dunes forming and vanishing in seconds. The trio approached cautiously. Each step into this new desertscape was like walking through a viscous fog. Sound distorted, gravity shifted, and their own bodies felt alien. Shapes moved just beyond vision, massive, unmoving, yet pulsing with intent. The desert watched, waiting, learning, feeding. A spike of light shot upward, blinding them, and they were yanked from the city entirely, suspended in an endless plain of wind and dust. Time lost all meaning. Mark glimpsed structures in the distance, impossible towers of sand, windows reflecting events that hadn't happened yet. Carlos screamed, but the sound was absorbed into the air, leaving only the raw sensation of fear. The desert began to speak, not in words, but in memory and sensation, flooding their minds with visions of lives that could have been, choices unmade, deaths avoided or inflicted. It demanded recognition, submission, and in that moment, the trio understood they were no longer visitors. They were subjects, witnesses to the desert's expansion, living conduits for its will. And then, as suddenly as it came, they were back on familiar asphalt. The city hummed normally. Traffic flowed. People walked by, unaware. The desert's imprint lingered only in their perception, a hidden current beneath the fabric of reality. But they knew the truth. It was not gone. It was patient. It was eternal. Each night, it would whisper again, probing for weakness, for fear, and the trio realized their fight was only beginning. The breach had not ended. They had opened a door, and the desert had begun to breathe through it. By nightfall, the city seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own. an undercurrent of soundless movement that gnawed at the edges of perception. Mark, Lena, and Carlos returned to their apartment, but it no longer felt safe. Doors whispered when they weren't touched, shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, and the hum of electricity carried a low, vibrating tone that set their teeth on edge. The desert wasn't content to remain outside it had followed, seeping into the very walls. The trio noticed subtle changes immediately. Photographs on the walls warped when glanced at directly. Family faces twisted into unknown expressions, eyes tracking them as if aware. Furniture seemed minutely rearranged, impossible shifts that suggested intent rather than accident. Even the air felt charged, heavy with a static that pricked the skin and made breathing a conscious effort. Lena attempted to record the anomalies with her camera. Each playback, however, revealed nothing, or rather, it revealed what the desert wanted them to see. Images shimmered, textures rippled unnaturally, and shadows of long-gone figures appeared in the footage. Carlos, panicking, tried to contact the outside world. Phones failed. Wi-Fi dropped in the middle of calls. The apartment was cut off. A bubble of suspended reality, where the desert's influence reigned. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible beneath the hum of their fear. Words in strange cadences slipped into their ears, promises of knowledge, threats of oblivion. At times, the whispers sounded like people they knew, friends, long absent, or even dead, urging them toward corners of the room, toward doors that led nowhere. They understood instantly. The desert did not merely occupy space, it manipulated perception, rewrote reality to bend the trio to its will. Carlos, desperate, smashed a window. Cold desert air and the scent of ozone poured in, but instead of relief, the intrusion intensified the whispers. Shapes coalesced in the foggy night air, humanoid but wrong, moving with jerky, unnatural precision, like marionettes controlled by a thought they could not comprehend. Mark tried to step outside, but the asphalt rippled beneath his feet, elongating and twisting, pulling him back inside. Lena's eyes darted to the corner of the room, where a dark figure, taller than any man, crouched. It had no discernible features, yet she felt it studying her with a sentience that was both alien and intimate. The figure stretched, stretching into the wall, becoming one with the plaster, the beams, the very structure of the building. It whispered her name, softly, irresistibly, promising answers in exchange for surrender. The night stretched. Hours, or was it days, blurred together. They huddled together, aware of the figure in the corner and the desert's reach through every wall and window. The apartment had become a nest, a testing ground. Fear was its tool, patience its weapon, and curiosity its bait. When dawn arrived, the city outside appeared normal, unscarred. People walked to work, cars honked, pigeons fluttered from lampposts. Yet inside, the trio knew the truth. The desert had claimed a foothold, and the walls themselves would carry its whispers. No place was safe, no barrier absolute. They had survived the night, but the desert's patience meant it would return, and next time, it would not speak so softly. By mid-morning, the city seemed untouched by the horrors of the previous night. Sunlight spilled across streets and alleys, revealing nothing unusual. But Mark, Lena, and Carlos knew the truth. The desert had moved. Its reach was no longer confined to their apartment. Windows reflected unnatural shapes. Lampposts cast shadows that shouldn't exist, and the hum of invisible energy followed them into the streets. At first, the signs were subtle. A pedestrian froze mid-step, staring blankly at nothing. Traffic lights flickered in impossible sequences, red and green swapping too quickly to obey any logic. Birds wheeled overhead in tight spirals, their calls harsh and unmelodious, as if mocking human perception. Lena felt the vibrations beneath her feet, soft, rhythmic pulses that aligned with the whispers from last night. They were calling her, guiding her, threatening to draw her into the unseen. Carlos tried to document it. He raised his phone to record the street, but the screen glitched. Every shadow stretched and bent, every reflection in glass seemed alive. When he turned the camera to Mark and Lena, their faces elongated in subtle, grotesque ways, as if the desert were reading their minds and reshaping their very identities in real time. Mark noticed something worse. Shop signs flickered with cryptic messages, words he could almost but not entirely understand. Return, follow, stay. The commands were insidious, drawing him closer to empty lots and abandoned alleys. He tried to resist, but an invisible pull tightened around his chest, forcing him forward. They sought refuge in a cafe. The chairs were familiar, the smell of coffee reassuring. But even here, the desert whispered. Laughter echoed that didn't belong to anyone present, and reflections in the mirrored. Walls moved independently, sometimes trailing the trio with a delay that suggested premeditation. Lena tried to speak, but words stuck in her throat. Carlos's hands shook violently as he tried to hold a cup, only for it to warp in his grip, solid becoming liquid and back again. Outside, the city began to change more rapidly. Cars swerved without drivers, doors slammed on their own, and streetlights blinked into shapes. Jagged, threatening figures that appeared alive. The desert was no longer patient. It was experimenting, extending its influence into spaces humans considered safe. By evening, the trio realized a horrifying truth. The desert didn't just occupy land. It occupied perception. Every street, every building, every mundane object could be a trap. Every sound might carry a hidden command, every shadow a watcher. They were trapped in a city that seemed normal to outsiders, but which had become a maze controlled by an intelligence they could barely comprehend. Mark, Lena, and Carlos retreated to the highest rooftop they could find. From there, the city sprawled below like a map, but one that pulsed with malevolent intent. The horizon shimmered, heat waves bending light in unnatural ways. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus that seemed to emanate from every inch of the urban landscape. Lena clutched Carlos's arm. Lena clutched Carlos's arm. "It's everywhere," she whispered. "It doesn't need walls anymore. It's in the city. It's in us." Mark nodded, staring at the shifting horizon. The desert had learned. It was no longer a remote, distant terror. It was adaptive, patient, and relentless. And the city had become its playground. The night promised no rest. Somewhere in the twisting streets below, the desert's influence would strike again, and next time, there might be no rooftop safe enough to escape it. Night fell like a curtain over the city, thick and suffocating. The streets shimmered under a sickly orange haze, the streetlights, bending and flickering as if alive. Mark, Lena, and Carlos descended from their rooftop refuge, thinking they could navigate through the familiar cityscape. But the desert had already rewritten the rules. Shadows began to detach themselves from the objects and people that cast them. A trash can's dark form stretched across the sidewalk, like a skeletal arm reaching for a passerby. A lamppost bent unnaturally, its elongated shadow slithering across the asphalt as if it had its own will. Shapes emerged, vague humanoid forms, too fluid to be solid, their movements deliberate and predatory. The trio tried to avoid the streets, ducking into a narrow alley. But the alley itself seemed to shift around them. Walls expanded and contracted, making familiar corners impossible to recognize. Every echo of their footsteps returned distorted, stretched in time, a mocking reminder that the city was no longer governed by ordinary physics. Carlos raised his phone to film the phenomena, but the screen warped, showing things that weren't there. Shadows detached from the walls entirely, forming twisted humanoid silhouettes that flitted at the edge of vision. One lingered too close. Mark could see the faint glint of eyes, impossibly bright against the darkness, and it felt as if the shadow were reading his thoughts, anticipating every step. A sudden wind gusted through the alley, carrying whispers, not in words exactly, but in urges, commands that filled the mind like a low hum vibrating in the skull. Lena froze, paralyzed, as a shadow slid along the wall toward her. She felt its intangible weight pressing down, bending perception, warping reality. Mark grabbed her hand, yanking her backward. The shadow recoiled, like a predator denied its prey. But it didn't disappear. It waited, lingering in the corners of vision, patient and hungry. As they ran, the desert's influence intensified. The skyline above undulated, the tops of buildings folding and bending in ways impossible in solid matter. Windows reflected streets that didn't exist, doors that opened into voids, stairways descending into endless blackness. Carlos shouted, but his voice warped, echoing back with added syllables, making the words almost unrecognizable. Suddenly they stumbled into a plaza. The air vibrated with a low hum, growing louder, almost tangible. From the center, a dark vortex seemed to rise from the ground, pulling shadows, debris, and even streetlight beams into its core. The humanoid forms converged, circling the vortex, dancing in twisted synchrony. The desert had created a nexus, a heart of its manifestation within the city. Lena fell to her knees, clutching her head as whispers became deafening. "It's everywhere!" she screamed. "It knows everything!" Mark gritted his teeth, searching for an exit. "We can't stay here," he said. "We have to keep moving. It's testing us, learning us." Carlos pointed to a side street, barely visible through the chaos. "There," he shouted. "We can make it!" The trio sprinted toward the narrow passage, but every step felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves were holding them back. Shapes twisted and lunged, reaching for fingers, ankles, even thoughts. The desert was no longer an environment. It was a predator, hunting, reshaping, consuming. As they disappeared into the alleyway, the vortex pulsed once, then faded, but the humanoid shadows remained, stalking silently, ever patient. The city itself had become a living extension of the desert's will, a labyrinth where nothing was safe, nothing was fixed, and the line between hunter and hunted was gone. The desert had moved into the city, and it would not stop. The alley gave way to a larger street, but the city had transformed completely. Buildings swayed like reeds in a storm, their foundations bending as if the ground itself had become liquid. The trio stumbled forward, hearts hammering, every shadow around them twitching with life. Even the pavement seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting underfoot, sucking at their shoes like a living entity. Voices whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, they were faint murmurs, incomprehensible, like static in a radio. Then words began to form half-sentences that clawed at their minds. Leave, or join. The messages felt alive, shaping fear directly into thought. Lena clutched her ears, trying to block it out. But the city didn't just speak, it demanded. Carlos paused, pointing ahead. "There's people. I see someone moving." A small group huddled near the cracked remains of a fountain. Their eyes glowed faintly, vacant, yet aware. One raised a hand, beckoning. But when the trio approached, the figures dissolved into smoke, reassembling as dark silhouettes with the same gleaming eyes. The desert had infected the city's population, bending them into puppets of shadow. Mark swallowed hard. "It's copying them, learning us through them." The trio pressed on, running down streets that curved impossibly, looping back on themselves. No matter the direction, the desert city seemed to anticipate, reshaping around them. Streetlights elongated like thin fingers, grabbing for clothing. Trash cans crawled along the ground, rolling like small predators. The air pulsed, thick with static, making every breath a struggle. Suddenly, a street sign bent overhead, forming a jagged archway. Beneath it, a shadow detached itself, a humanoid figure taller than any human should be. Its face was featureless, smooth, yet exuded malevolence. It stopped, raising an arm, and the whispers intensified into a deafening roar in their minds. Lena stumbled, falling into Mark's arms. "It knows what we're thinking. Every fear, every hope," she gasped. "It's alive." Carlos, panting, yanked his backpack open, frantically pulling out a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the shadow. For a heartbeat, the figure paused, recoiling as if hurt by the light. But then it advanced, gliding rather than walking, relentless. Mark realized the desert's power was vulnerable to exposure. If they could keep the shadows in sight, perhaps they could survive, Keep the lights on. Don't let them touch us." They moved as one, the flashlight beams weaving between them, carving a path through the living nightmare. Shadows lunged from walls, pavement, and air itself, but the trio pressed forward, instinctively following the faint hum that seemed to guide them through the chaos. The plaza loomed ahead, the vortex from before still faintly spinning, a beacon of unnatural energy. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heart pumping darkness through the city. Mark's mind reeled. If we can reach that, maybe we can shut it down, end this. As they sprinted toward the vortex, the shadows converged in waves, forming a wall of writhing darkness. Yet, something deeper, older, and far more intelligent than simple fear whispered in Mark's mind. They cannot stop me. They will all become part of the city. All of you. The desert was no longer a place, it was a consciousness, an intelligence, a predator that had learned patience over millennia. And now, it had found the perfect hunting ground, the human mind. The trio's survival depended on getting to the vortex. But as the shadows lunged, the city itself seemed to pulse, the streets bending into impossible angles. Time slowed, then skipped, then fractured, and the desert whispered, "Hungry." The trio surged forward, flashlight beams cutting through the thickening shadows. The city's streets had become a labyrinth of impossible geometry. Buildings twisted upward like gnarled fingers, balconies curling back on themselves, and intersections folded inward until the horizon seemed to vanish. Every step echoed strangely, as if the pavement itself whispered secrets of 1,000 lost souls. Carlos stumbled on the uneven ground, nearly falling. It's warping reality," he gasped. We're inside its mind now." Mark nodded grimly, scanning the vortex ahead. It hung in the plaza like a black sun, rotating slowly, radiating a cold, tangible pulse that tugged at their nerves. The air smelled of scorched earth and ozone. Even breathing felt wrong, as if the desert had replaced the oxygen with something heavier, more corrosive. Shadows surged from the walls and ground, converging into humanoid shapes. Their featureless faces gleamed with a faint, sickly light. Lena swung her flashlight frantically, carving arcs of illumination, and for brief moments, the shapes recoiled. But the shadows were not merely reactive, they were learning. Every movement they made was anticipated, mirrored, and amplified. "We have to reach the vortex," Mark shouted. "It's the source." As they ran, the ground beneath them quivered, rippling like a pond in a storm. Pavement split open, black tendrils of shadow snaking toward them. Lena tripped, yelping as a tendril wrapped around her ankle. Mark lunged, yanking her free, but more hands of darkness followed, grasping, clutching at their clothing, their hair, their limbs. Carlos shouted, "It wants to absorb us! It's feeding on fear!" The trio sprinted across the plaza, finally reaching the edge of the vortex. It pulsed with a rhythmic energy, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. As they approached, their surroundings began to blur. The twisted buildings, the writhing shadows, even their own bodies felt stretched and unreal. Mark reached toward the vortex. The moment his fingers brushed the edge, the city shuddered violently, and the shadows froze. A deafening roar filled their minds, a sound that was not sound but thought, memory, and instinct all at once. "You cannot stop me. I am the desert. I am the city. I am time itself." Lena screamed, clutching her head. "It knows. Us. It knows everything." But Carlos, thinking fast, grabbed a piece of broken concrete from the plaza floor and slammed it into the vortex's edge. A shockwave of light and sound burst outward. The shadows screamed, twisting and recoiling into themselves. The building stuttered in place, reality flickering like a dying hologram. The trio realized that the vortex, the core of the city desert, was not invincible. It was reactive, not infinite. If they could destabilize it, they might escape. Mark yelled, "Keep hitting it! Keep it off balance!" They struck the vortex again and again, their combined fear and desperation fueling the impact. Each strike sent ripples through the city, and the shadows screamed as they were pulled into the pulsating void. The streets began to straighten, the impossible angles correcting themselves, and the hum of the city began to fade. Finally, with one last desperate push, The vortex imploded, collapsing inward in on itself. The shadows vanished with a silent scream, leaving the trio alone on the cracked plaza. The city was still, eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Mark sank to the ground, panting. Is it over? Lena, trembling, looked around. I think we survived. But it's still here, in some form. Waiting. Carlos nodded slowly. The desert doesn't sleep. It waits for the next mind to wander too far. The city exhaled, and the desert whispered. The desert was quiet, too quiet. After leaving the warped city, Mark, Lena, and Carlos trudged back across the cracked sand, each step echoing louder than it should have. The sun hung low, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe independently, twisting with a life of their own. I don't like this, Lena whispered, clutching her backpack strap. It feels wrong, like the city didn't let us go. Carlos scanned the horizon. You're right, something followed us. I can feel it. Mark shook his head, trying to focus. No, it's just exhaustion. Nothing that matters. But the desert had other plans. A ripple of movement passed over the sand, too fluid to be wind, too deliberate to be natural. Shadows pooled and grew, forming dark shapes that crawled across the dunes toward them. Each one was featureless, yet unnervingly familiar, like a reflection of themselves, twisted and wrong. Lena froze. It's them. From the city. The shapes advanced silently, their forms stretching and stretching, elongating unnaturally, bending the light around them. The air grew thick and metallic, pressing against their lungs, making it hard to breathe. Even speaking felt dangerous, as if their words could draw attention. Carlos gritted his teeth. We need to move. Run. They broke into a sprint, sand churning beneath their feet. The shadows mirrored every movement, keeping pace no matter how fast they ran. Even when they dove into shallow ravines or scrambled over rocky outcrops, the darkness followed, stretching impossibly to reach them. Mark's heart pounded. It's learning, adapting. We can't outrun it. Ahead, a faint shimmer glinted in the sand. A mirage or hope? They couldn't tell. The desert was warping reality again, twisting time and space. A single misstep could trap them forever. Suddenly, a shadow lunged, enveloping Carlos's leg. He screamed as the darkness pulled him down. Mark and Lena stopped, panting, torn between saving him and fleeing. Lena grabbed his arm, yanking him free. We're stronger together, she yelled. The trio ran, pushing through the invisible barrier, past the dunes that seemed to bend around them, past the dunes that weren't really dunes, until the city's influence began to fade. The shadows hesitated, flickering like a failing projection, then dissipated into the desert wind. They collapsed onto the sand, hearts racing, lungs burning. Silence returned, but it felt hollow. The desert was still alive, still watching. Carlos looked around, voice shaking. It's not gone. It's still out there, waiting for the next mind to wander too far. Lena shivered, staring at the horizon. And maybe it never really leaves anyone who enters its city. Mark swallowed hard, knowing she was right. Whatever they had survived, whatever they had faced, the desert and its city had left a mark. Something deep inside each of them now belonged to the shadows. As the sun set, painting the sky blood red, the desert whispered secrets too old to understand, and the city they had escaped remained alive in the distance, silent but patient, waiting for the next wanderer. The nightmare was over for now. The weeks after the desert felt like walking through a fogged mirror. Mark, Lena, and Carlos tried to return to normal life, but every familiar sound, every shadowed corner of their apartment seemed to pulse with the memory of the city. Sleep offered no escape. At night, their dreams were invaded by twisting streets, impossible staircases, and the whispers that had followed them out of the desert. Mark awoke in a cold sweat, his walls stretching, bending, the shadows of his furniture growing into towering, grasping figures. The whispers were soft, but unmistakable. Come back. Come back. At work, he found himself staring at patterns in the wallpaper, seeing the impossible angles of the city etched into mundane geometry. A colleague's cough sounded like laughter in a corridor he didn't recognize. He blinked, and the room was normal again, yet he knew it wasn't. Lena fared no better. Every reflection betrayed her. In mirrors, she saw herself elongated, her arms too long, her eyes hollowed, and behind her own reflection, a figure moved always just out of sync, always mimicking her, always watching. She tried to cover every mirror, every reflective surface, but some mirrors couldn't be covered. In windows, in polished spoons, in back, the dark glaze of her coffee. Carlos's descent was the fastest. He began hearing voices when he was awake. Low, guttural, almost friendly, coaxing him, calling him to return to the desert. They promised knowledge, power, understanding. He tried to ignore them, tried to resist. But the voices grew louder each night, merging with his own thoughts until he couldn't tell where he ended and the desert began. One evening, the three of them met at the small park they had once walked through after surviving the desert. The air smelled wrong, acrid with sand that wasn't there. Mark whispered, "It's inside us. We can't escape it." Lena's eyes were wide, haunted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The city. It's alive. And it's calling us back. Always calling." Carlos clenched his fists. "It's not just calling, it's teaching. It wants us to learn, to see, but at what cost?" And then the wind began to shift, strange shapes skimming the surface of the empty park. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, flickering in impossible directions. The whispers became louder, almost intelligible, like a language just beyond understanding. The trio realized a terrifying truth. Surviving the city didn't mean escaping it. Its influence was not bound by walls or geography. It had entered their minds, woven into their perceptions, and would haunt them in every reflection, every dream, every silence. As night fell, the first stars blinked coldly in the sky, but even their light seemed hesitant, as if the universe itself feared the city's reach. Mark, Lena, and Carlos knew their journey was far from over. The desert might have released them physically, but the whispers in their minds had only just begun. The city's shadow had followed them home, and it was patient. It started subtly. Doors that should have opened normally jammed at impossible angles. Hallways stretched into endless corridors. Rooms seemed to breathe. Walls inching closer or recoiling with a life of their own. Mark was the first to notice. One morning, he stepped into his apartment and froze. His living room was larger, wider, unfamiliar. The furniture was rearranged in ways he hadn't moved it. Shadows pooled in corners where corners shouldn't exist. Lena arrived later, phone in hand. She tried to call Carlos, but the line hummed with static, punctuated by faint whispers that mirrored their own conversations. Her reflection in the hallway mirror flickered unnaturally. For a moment, she swore it smiled back at her with a mouth she didn't have. Carlos appeared shortly after, breathing hard, his eyes darting to the ceiling and floor as if they were alive. "It's the city," he whispered. It's following us. It doesn't just want us to remember. It wants us to live inside it." That night, the walls of Mark's apartment shifted while he slept. He awoke trapped in a room with no doors, only windows that looked out onto infinite versions of the city's streets. The whispering intensified, now threaded with urgency, almost like commands. Follow the streets, return, understand. Desperate, the trio decided to meet at a familiar location in the city, the small diner where they had once tried to rationalize the impossible. But even that place was altered. Neon signs flickered with messages that seemed to move, spelling their names one moment, then warning them to stay away the next. Chairs arranged themselves into spirals, and a low humming came from the floor itself. Mark touched a table and felt it ripple beneath his fingers like water. "This isn't real," he said, though his voice trembled. "Nothing is real anymore." Lena, gripping his arm, whispered, "The city isn't just a place, it's a force. It wants to rewrite everything. It wants to break us." Carlos, pale and shivering, pointed toward the back alley. Shadows, slithered along the walls like living creatures, converging into shapes he didn't dare name. "It's alive," he breathed. "It's alive, and it's hungry for us to understand, or to join it." By dawn, they realized the city's influence extended beyond perception. The laws of space, gravity, and time seemed pliable, bending at the will of something unseen. Mark found himself walking through a street that repeated endlessly. Lena caught in a doorway that led back to itself, and Carlos, whispering frantically, admitted he couldn't tell the difference between memory and reality. The trio understood that their fight was no longer about survival. They had to preserve their minds. Every step outside, every reflective surface, every shadow could be a trap. The city's hunger was patient, calculating, and it was ready to exploit all three. As night fell once more, the streets around them stretched and contracted like a living organism, the whispers swelling into a chorus of impossibility. They had survived the desert, but the city was patient. It had only just begun to play its game. By midday, Mark, Lena, and Carlos had gathered in what felt like a corner of the city that still obeyed some rules. The air was heavy, almost viscous, and the streets seemed to hum under their feet, a low, vibrating pulse that made it impossible to think clearly. Each step they took produced echoes that didn't match their movements. Footsteps lagged behind or ran ahead of them. Mark spread a crumpled notebook on a cracked concrete table, paper edges curling as if alive. "We need a map," he said, "even a rough one. If we can understand its logic, maybe we can anticipate the shifts." Lena shook her head. "The city doesn't have logic, Mark. It's chaos. It learns. It remembers. Every street we walk, every turn we take, it's adjusting around us." Carlos, staring at a puddle that reflected not the sky above but another street entirely, shivered. "It's reading us," he muttered. "It knows our fears, our doubts. It's using them." "Still," they began. Mark drew streets as he remembered them, labeling familiar cafes, lampposts, and alleyways. Lena corrected him when a building appeared in the wrong place, though the structure seemed to shimmer with indecision. Carlos added notes of sounds, smells, and whispers, cataloging the patterns of the city's attention. Hours passed. The city responded immediately. Windows rearranged themselves, alleys looped in unexpected angles, and shadows thickened near corners where they lingered too long. Every correction they made was challenged by the city itself, a living puzzle mocking their effort to impose order. Suddenly, a street stretched out ahead like a tunnel. Their path, which should have taken 5 minutes, now extended for miles, the horizon folding in unnatural arcs. Lena gripped Mark's arm, teeth clenched. "It's testing us," she whispered. "It wants us to panic." Carlos, scribbling furiously, looked up. "If it's testing us, then maybe we need to anticipate the test. Think ahead, not just react. If we move as one and force patterns, maybe we can trick it into stability." They decided on a method. Mark would lead, drawing routes with calculated risk. Lena would observe anomalies, noting shifts that suggested intent. Carlos would chronicle everything, building a real-time map that evolved as they moved. The city seemed to respond, stretching and folding, but also settling briefly, granting small windows of navigable reality. Hours blurred into an unmeasurable span. Hunger and fatigue clawed at their resolve, but the map grew, a fragile scaffold against the chaos. And then, as the sun, or what they assumed was the sun, slipped toward a false horizon, a pattern emerged. Streets they had walked repeatedly formed a loop. Familiar intersections aligned. The city, for a fleeting moment, obeyed something outside itself, the order imposed by their collective understanding. But the city was patient. The map was fragile. One misstep, one lapse in focus, and the streets would twist again, and they would be lost. As night descended, the trio realized something terrifying. The city wasn't just a maze, it was aware. And every map they drew, every path they memorized, only gave it more knowledge of them. Mark closed the notebook, trembling. It's not about escaping, it's about surviving it without letting it know we're trying. The city waited, Shadows stretched. Whispers coalesced into a voice soft, amused, and impossibly close. "So, you think you can map me?" Night had fully swallowed the city. Streetlights flickered, casting pools of orange that stretched like liquid shadows across cracked asphalt. Mark, Lena, and Carlos moved cautiously, following the fragile map they had painstakingly assembled. But even as they walked, the city shifted beneath them, corridors bending and twisting, alleys elongating like serpents in the dark. "It's changing again," Lena whispered, voice tight with fear. She pointed to a street that had previously ended in a dead end, now stretching endlessly into darkness. "It's remembering where we've been. Every step we take, it files away." Carlos paused, staring at a puddle that no longer reflected the world above. Instead, the rippling water showed flashes of places they had visited earlier: cafes, street corners, even the crumpled notebook on the concrete table. Each reflection was slightly wrong. A door in the wrong place, a street sign with letters scrambled. Mark clenched his jaw. "It's using our memories against us. We can't trust what we've seen, what we think we remember." He paused, tracing a finger along a cracked manhole cover. "We need to force it to forget, to reset the pattern." Lena shook her head violently. "We can't reset it. That's not how this works. It's alive, Mark. It learns. Every correction we make, every street we redraw, every pattern we notice, it absorbs, it stores it, and it watches us while we do it." The air thickened, charged with an invisible energy that made hairs on their necks stand on end. Whispers rose from the buildings, distant but insistent, as if the city itself was speaking to them through a chorus of walls, pipes, and cracked glass. Words formed, incomprehensible yet somehow intelligible. "You move, we remember. You pause, we see. You fear, we feed." Carlos swallowed hard. "It's not just a city. It's a predator." Mark nodded, gripping the notebook tighter. "Then we survive by being unpredictable. We can't just follow the paths we've mapped. We have to create chaos in our wake. Give it false information. Split our attention. Make it doubt itself." They split briefly, moving in zigzag patterns, doubling back, pretending to explore one path while secretly traversing another. The streets writhed, twisting faster than they could track. Shadows broke free of lampposts and chased them, only to dissipate when confronted. The air vibrated with tension, the whispering growing louder, more insistent, almost impatient. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. They stumbled into an abandoned square, surrounded by high-rising buildings that loomed like silent sentinels. In the center, an impossibly twisted fountain gurgled black water, reflecting not the sky, but a fragmented vision of their own memories. Misaligned streets, impossible doors, and fleeting glimpses of a shadowy figure that seemed to mirror each of them. Lena trembled. "It's showing us." "Us." Mark's voice was low, steadying himself. "It doesn't just remember the city. It remembers us. Every fear, every hesitation, every hope. That's what it's hunting." The city had become a predator, and they were the prey. But they had learned one vital truth. Awareness was their only weapon. As long as they understood that the streets remembered, that the city watched, they could play the game, mislead it, survive it. Yet even as hope flickered, a whisper drifted from the darkened alleys, carrying an unmistakable menace. "And now, you are part of me." The abandoned square offered no safety. The black water in the twisted fountain shimmered unnaturally, rippling as if stirred by invisible hands. Mark, Lena, and Carlos stepped cautiously, but the moment their reflections touched the surface, the city reacted. In the water, they didn't see themselves. Instead, each reflection twisted into monstrous versions of their worst fears. Mark's face elongated into a skeletal grin, teeth razor-sharp and eyes hollow yet burning. Lena saw herself buried alive, screaming silently beneath layers of concrete and earth. Carlos's hands twisted into claws, his shadow crawling across the cobblestones like a living thing. "It's feeding on fear," Lena whispered, backing away, voice trembling. "It knows what we're afraid of." It's using it against us. The air thickened, heavy and cold. Shadows lengthened and detached from walls, curling around them like vipers. Whispers had turned into chants, low and insistent, echoing from all directions. The city was alive, aware, and fully aware of their terror. Mark clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. We can't show it fear. If it sees weakness, it will trap us forever. Carlos laughed nervously. Easier said than done when your reflection is a monster trying to claw you through a fountain. Lena scanned the square, eyes catching glimmers of movement, doors where none had been. Alleyways appearing and disappearing like smoke, each path suggesting safety but leading to nowhere. The city was testing them, probing for mistakes. Mark grabbed the notebook and scribbled furiously, trying to create a mental map, any pattern the city could not anticipate. We move together, never alone, he commanded. We decide first, the city reacts second. If we let it dictate, we're done. They advance slowly, forcing themselves to ignore the reflections, focusing instead on small details, the angle of a streetlight, the irregular crack in the pavement. Each step became a battle of perception. Every shadow could be a trap. Every whisper could be a lie. Suddenly, the fountain erupted. Black water shot into the air, coalescing into shapes, figures that mimicked their movements, but moved faster, sharper, more violent. The reflections were no longer confined to the fountain. The city had projected them into reality. Lena screamed as a figure lunged, only to vanish into thin air, leaving her disoriented. Mark grabbed her arm. Don't react. Don't give it satisfaction. Carlos, breathing heavily, realized the horrifying truth. It's learning faster than us. Every time we flinch, every time we doubt, it gets stronger. This isn't just a city anymore. It's an intelligence. Mark's eyes narrowed. Then we fight differently. We stop reacting emotionally. We force it to see calm, to see confidence. If it's feeding on fear, we starve it. They close their eyes, synchronize their breathing, and step forward as one. Shadows recoiled, whispers faltered. The twisted reflections shimmered, losing coherence, fragments of fear dissolving into darkness. But even as the city faltered, a new, more sinister awareness emerged. A single thought seemed to pierce the silence, resonating deep within their minds. You can hide your fear, but you cannot hide your memory. The city no longer needed reflections or shadows. It had learned to reach inside, prying open the doors of memory and dragging their pasts into the present. As Mark, Lena, and Carlos stepped cautiously through a narrow alley, the walls themselves began to pulse, their surfaces shifting like wet skin. Whispered voices drifted from nowhere and everywhere at once, each syllable unmistakably familiar. Mark, Mark, he froze. The voice was his mother's, the one he hadn't heard in years, calling him from a memory he had tried to bury. The pavement cracked beneath his feet, forming a spiral that seemed to descend into darkness. Shapes emerged from the fisher's childhood fears he had thought forgotten. The empty crib, the locked closet, the shadowed hallway where he had once felt trapped and alone. Lena's face contorted as she reached a doorway that wasn't there before. Through it, she saw her younger self, trapped in a school burning with flames that smelled like her old nightmares. "No, not again," she cried, pounding on the invisible barrier. But the younger self didn't notice. The city had rendered her helpless. Carlos stumbled, a sudden wave of panic rising in his chest. He saw his father's stern silhouette, towering over him, shouting words that were long buried, but now screamed through his mind. "You're worthless. You'll never escape." The figure lunged with a force born from memory, a physical manifestation of the guilt and shame he had carried for decades. The city pulsed around them, alive with their histories. Every step forward summoned more memories, each more vivid, more painful than the last. They realized with a shudder that this place was not just a labyrinth, it was a mirror of the soul, a living repository of their trauma. Every fear, every regret, every buried secret had been collected, cataloged, and weaponized. Mark took a shaky breath, gripping Lena's hand. It's feeding on more than fear now, he said, voice low. It's feeding on everything we've been trying to forget. If we lose control here, it will destroy us from the inside. Lena nodded, determination hardening her features. Then, we stop running. We confront it. Every memory it throws at us, we face it. Together. They moved forward, deliberately stepping into the MR. Whirl of twisted streets and shifting walls. Each memory became a trial. Mark walked through the spiral of his childhood terror, letting the echoes of his mother's voice wash over him without flinching. Lena forced herself into the burning school, her mind steady, even as smoke choked her lungs. Carlos confronted the spectral figure of his father, standing tall and refusing to bow to the past's cruel authority. The city recoiled. The walls shuddered, the pavement quaked, and the whispers faltered. Their bravery became a weapon, turning the city's power back against itself. The memories that had once enslaved them now became shields. Each confrontation was a strike, and with every strike, the city faltered further. Finally, they reached a vast square at the heart of the labyrinth. At its center, the city's consciousness had taken form, a massive, shifting figure of darkness, eyes glimmering with everything they had feared, yet now unsure. Mark stepped forward. We remember. We feel, but we are not yours. The darkness pulsed, shrieked, and then it fragmented. Shadows dissolved into mist, memories scattered like leaves in the wind. The city's grip weakened, though a low, haunting murmur echoed in their minds. This is not the end. I will return. Even in victory, the air carried a warning. The city was patient, and patient was eternal. Even after the collapse of the central shadow, the city did not rest. The air hummed with an unseen energy, vibrating with the echoes of every memory it had consumed. Streets stretched and contracted unpredictably, corners twisting into impossible angles. Mark, Lena, and Carlos found themselves moving through an environment that no longer obeyed the laws of physics. Sidewalks led upward into walls. Streetlights bent toward the ground like reaching fingers, and windows reflected not what was outside, but the deepest fears within. A sudden chill swept over them as a door appeared midair. It hovered, unhinged from any wall or floor, radiating a faint blue glow. Lena approached cautiously. This isn't a door. It's a portal into the city's mind, she whispered. Her voice trembled. Mark hesitated. If we step through, we risk losing ourselves. This place doesn't just twist the streets, it twists the soul. Carlos didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the reflections in the puddles forming spontaneously around them. Each puddle showed a different version of himself. A man who had surrendered to fear, a man consumed by anger, a man who had vanished into the city decades ago. The multiplicity of selves made his stomach churn. Enough, Lena said sharply. She grabbed their hands. We face it together. That's the only way out. They stepped through the floating doors simultaneously, and reality snapped. The ground disappeared, replaced by a dizzying void of shifting shapes and colors. Voices whispered around them, impossible to localize. Past lovers, old friends, long-forgotten enemies. Each syllable struck like a knife, cutting through the thin veil of their courage. Mark felt himself pulled toward a figure that mirrored his younger self, scared, trembling, begging for help. He resisted. I am not lost, he said aloud, the words steadying him. Lena and Carlos each confronted their own reflections, holding on to one unbroken thought. We are not alone. The city hissed in frustration. Its fabric rippled violently, attempting to erase them, to absorb their very identities into its chaotic memory. But their unity formed a shield. The bond of shared fear and determination became tangible, a thread holding them together as the city writhed around them. Suddenly, the void coalesced into a corridor. Walls made of broken glass reflected fragments of their lives, but the path ahead remained solid. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows, a promise that the city was far from finished. This is only the beginning, Mark said, his voice echoing unnaturally. The city adapts, it learns, And it remembers everything we try to leave behind. Lena nodded, eyes fixed on the corridor ahead. Then we keep moving. Every step is a fight. Every step is freedom. The trio advanced, their shadows stretching impossibly long, merging with and yet resisting the city's hunger. Behind them, the whispering streets shivered, a warning that no one could ever truly leave the city's memory. And somewhere deep within its twisting core, the city waited, patient and eternal, calculating its next move. The corridors stretched endlessly, a kaleidoscope of fractured reflections and impossible angles. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the city itself were weighing down their bones. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, faces of strangers, of loved ones long gone, of moments they could barely remember but somehow feared losing. The air smelled of ozone and rust, tangling with a faint scent of smoke from a fire that had never burned. Lena led the way, her hand gripping Mark's, while Carlos scanned the shifting walls. "The city, it's feeding on us," he said, voice low. "It wants to rewrite our memories, trap us inside its history." Suddenly, the floor beneath them liquefied into a dark mirror. Their reflections twisted grotesquely. Mark's face split into a dozen versions of himself, each screaming silently. Lena's eyes glowed a hollow white. Carlos's arms elongated into impossible shapes, reaching for things that didn't exist. Panic flared, but Lena held them steady. "Don't fight it with fear. Name what you remember as real. Hold on to your truth." They stepped carefully across the mirrored surface, but the city retaliated. The reflections began speaking in unison, whispering secrets they had never shared, dredging up guilt, shame, and doubt. Mark's own reflection accused him of every failure he had ever committed, a litany of personal betrayals. Carlos's mirrored self mimicked his every insecurity, amplifying it until he felt it in his bones. Lena's reflection laughed, echoing with voices she had lost, mocking her courage. "Focus," Lena shouted. "We are not them. Their lies are not ours." With each assertion, the mirrored floor solidified momentarily, granting them a fragile footing. The walls shifted again, this time forming doorways into past moments of their lives. Mark glimpsed his childhood bedroom, the night of the fire that had scarred him. Carlos saw the hospital room where his mother had died, every sound amplified and distorted. Lena stepped into a memory of her first betrayal, the sting of trust broken like glass against her skin. The city's voice rose a deafening crescendo of every lost, forgotten, and buried moment. It demanded submission. It promised eternal entrapment, a final absorption of their identities into its endless memory. The corridor twisted into a spiral staircase, its steps floating in void, each one lined with memories poised to engulf them. Mark clenched his fists. "We decide what stays and what goes. We write our own story." Carlos nodded, his voice steady. "The city can try to trap us, but it can't own us if we remember who we are." Lena took a deep breath. Together, they climbed, hand in hand, each step an act of defiance. The city shrieked, a chorus of every life it had consumed. Fragments of memories swirled around them, attempting to pierce their minds. Yet their unity created a force stronger than fear, a tether to reality, fragile but undeniable. At the top of the spiral, a faint light appeared, a portal, glowing white, pulsing with a rhythm that felt like hope. The city thrashed violently, but could not reach them. Step by step, they approached it, leaving behind the echoes of countless stolen moments, claiming only what belonged to them, their courage, their bond, and the truth of their own lives. The city hissed, in fury behind them, a warning, a promise, a reminder. It was patient, eternal, and it would wait for the next travelers foolish enough to enter its labyrinth. The portal shimmered ahead, but the corridor behind them had not relinquished its hold. The city, hungry for dominance, began to manifest their fears into tangible forms. Shadows peeled from the walls, twisting into monstrous silhouettes. Each step forward made them heavier, as if the air itself were alive and trying to drag them back. Mark felt hands cold, clawed, unyielding grip his ankles. They weren't his imagination. The city had learned to touch, to pull, to wound. He yanked free, only to see a figure rising from the floor, a grotesque mockery of his father, eyes, black voids, mouth gaping in a silent scream. The creature lunged, moving with impossible speed. Carlos turned, raising his hands instinctively. Shadows coalesced into serpentine forms, their scales shimmering with every distorted memory of his childhood failures. He swung at them, but his fists passed through smoke and darkness. "They're feeding on our doubt," he shouted, voice echoing unnaturally. "They can't touch our certainty." Lena pressed forward, eyes scanning the flickering space for patterns, for weakness. Shapes emerged behind every reflection, every doorway, every crack in the walls, figures pulled from nightmares she had never spoken aloud. The city wasn't just haunted, it was intelligent, hunting their very thoughts. Suddenly, the air thickened, the shadows pressing in from all sides. A voice whispered inside their minds, seductive and intimate. "You belong to me. Your past, your fears, they are mine." Lena's vision swam. She fought to remember herself, to remember her friends. "We are not yours," she screamed, each word cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadows recoiled. They writhed, screamed, and tried to reshape themselves into new forms, but the city's grip wavered. Mark, Lena, and Carlos joined hands, forming a chain of defiance. Their fear was still present, but it was no longer a weapon the city could wield without resistance. A massive figure emerged, taller than the corridor itself, formed from 100 past regrets of all three. Its arms stretched toward them, each finger a shard of shattered memory, and yet their unity made it hesitate. "Together," Lena said, voice calm but fierce, "we define what is real." Step by step they advanced. The shadows lunged, recoiling when touched by their combined courage. Memories that had been twisted into weapons now became shields. The monstrous figure roared a sound made of every doubt, every shame, every buried terror, but the trio refused to look away. Finally, the portal ahead pulsed brighter, a beckoning white light slicing through the darkness. The figure faltered, its body dissolving into smoke. The city hissed, a sound of fury and frustration that echoed in every corner of the endless corridor. Mark, Lena, and Carlos ran the final steps, crossing the threshold together. Behind them, the labyrinth groaned and twisted, as if it had been wounded but not defeated. The city's voice faded, leaving only an eerie silence. They had survived, for now. Outside the portal, the world waited. Sunlight, or what passed for sunlight in this distorted reality, washed over them, but the taste of fear lingered on their skin. The labyrinth had tested them, reshaped them, and reminded them of the price of memory and courage. But somewhere, deep beneath the mirrored floors and twisted walls, the city waited, patient, eternal. And the echoes of its shadows promised it would rise again. The air outside the portal was deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the fractured sky, casting shards of gold on the scarred landscape. For a moment, Mark, Lena, and Carlos thought they had escaped, but a subtle vibration ran beneath their feet, like the pulse of some living heartbeat. The city had not stayed behind, it had followed. At first it was small things, a shadow curling around a lamppost, a reflection in a puddle that didn't match reality. Then, objects began to move independently. A street sign twisted its metal, bending like molten wax. Cars shuddered, their doors opening and closing, as if the city itself was trying to communicate. Mark ran his hand across a nearby wall, but it felt wrong, soft, pliant, almost breathing. He pulled back, horrified to see the concrete ripple like water. "It's not just in the labyrinth anymore," he whispered. "It's spreading." From the windows of abandoned buildings, dark figures emerged. They were familiar shapes, but distorted people they had known, memories warped into grotesque parodies. Lena shouted, forcing herself not to look away. Each step they took sent waves of the city's essence spilling into the world around them. The labyrinth wasn't confined, it was a virus. A distant scream echoed down the cracked streets. Carlos sprinted toward it, only to find an empty doorway. The sound came again, closer, but still no source. It's using our fears to manifest, he realized. The city could now manipulate reality, feeding on imagination itself. Buildings contorted, streets folded over themselves, and the sky darkened unnaturally, streaked with impossible geometries. Time seemed to falter. Moments stretched and snapped back, leaving disorientation in their wake. The trio's own reflections twisted in puddles and windows, showing them faces that were not theirs, whispering secrets they had never shared. Lena clenched her fists. "It wants us to panic," she said. "We can't give it the power." Each of them focused on a memory of courage, a moment of victory over fear. As they did, the creeping distortions recoiled slightly. The city hissed, a sound like shattering glass, and recoiled back from the edges of the streets. But its retreat was temporary. Every structure, every shadow, every reflection carried a trace of its presence. The city had leaked into the world. Even if they destroyed what was visible, it could remain hidden, patient, waiting for doubt to grow again. Mark, Lena, and Carlos moved through the warped streets, realizing that the battle was no longer just for survival, it was for reality itself. They could escape the labyrinth, but the city's influence had already crossed into the world beyond. Every corner, every mirror, every shadow was now a potential doorway. And somewhere, deep beneath the cracked earth, the labyrinth pulsed like a heartbeat, laughing silently at the chaos it had begun. The city had left its walls, but it had not left the fight. Mark, Lena, and Carlos stumbled through the warped streets, each step feeling heavier than the last. The city had grown bolder overnight, its distortions crawling into every corner of the landscape. Streetlights stretched upward like skeletal fingers, buildings leaning impossibly toward them. Shadows slithered across cracked asphalt, whispering words that seemed to scrape at the edges of their minds. The labyrinth had leaked into the world, and now reality itself trembled beneath its influence. Lena stopped abruptly, pointing to a street corner. The concrete beneath their feet writhed, forming an intricate pattern, an arcane lattice glowing faintly with a sickly green light. "It's a focus," she whispered. "If we can disrupt it here, maybe we can contain it." Carlos knelt, examining the strange lattice. Symbols they had never seen before, pulsed in rhythm with the city's heartbeat. "It's like it's anchoring itself to reality," he said. "If we collapse this, maybe the rest will shrink back." Mark swallowed hard. "And if we fail?" Lena's jaw tightened. "Then the city spreads, and nothing outside this block is safe." They set to work, using whatever knowledge they had gained inside the labyrinth. Patterns, sequences, and vibrations that seemed to correspond with the city's pulse. Every time they made progress, the surrounding architecture groaned, as though the world itself resented their interference. A building shivered, shedding windows that melted into puddles. Shadows lunged from alleyways, clawing at their minds with visions of their worst fears. "Focus on the lattice," Mark shouted over the din. "Don't let it distract you." The three of them worked in unison, hands tracing the glowing runes, voices chanting the sequences they had memorized from the labyrinth's inner core. The lattice resisted, bending light and warping air, but inch by inch, it began to collapse inward. A wave of cold swept through the street, chilling them to their bones. A cacophony of whispers rose, 1,000 voices of the city screaming in defiance. Lena's vision blurred, but she gritted her teeth and held the sequence steady. Then, silence. The lattice imploded in on itself with a final flash of green, leaving the street empty, normal, and utterly still. The warped buildings stood straight, shadows flattened, and the air smelled of rain. The city had recoiled. They collapsed to the ground, exhausted, hearts racing. "Is it over?" Carlos asked. Lena shook her head. "Not really. It's contained, for now. But every distortion, every shadow, it's still alive somewhere, waiting for doubt, fear, or curiosity to feed it." Mark stared at the horizon, now calm but eerily quiet. "We may have stopped it today," he said, "but the city is patient. It doesn't forget. It only waits." In that silence, they realized the full scale of their ordeal. The labyrinth's influence was no longer confined. The world outside was forever marked by its pulse, a reminder that the boundaries of reality were fragile. And somewhere, beneath streets, buildings, and empty fields, the city bided its time, ready to leak again when the next whisper of fear or wonder reached its ears. They had won the battle, but the war was eternal. The night after the lattice collapsed, the world felt wrong. Mark noticed it first. A street lamp flickered, not with electricity, but with a strange, pulsing rhythm, as if breathing. Shadows didn't fall where they should. They lingered, stretching, curling, and whispering unintelligible words whenever someone passed. Even the air felt heavier, charged with a subtle tension that prickled the skin. Lena was uneasy. "It's like the city remembers," she said. "Like it's studying us, waiting." Carlos checked his equipment. Nothing should be reading this. Magnetic fields normal, no radiation spikes. Yet something's here, something left behind. They ventured out cautiously, past streets that seemed familiar but subtly different. A man walked by, but his reflection in a puddle didn't match him. It moved independently, watching them. They froze, hearts hammering, but the reflection smiled and stepped away. When they looked back at the man, he was gone. "It's learning, or testing," Lena whispered. "It's seeing how we react, what scares us." The trio reached the edge of the city, the boundary where warped reality once bled into the normal world. The area was eerily calm, almost peaceful, but under the surface, the cracks were growing finer, hairline fractures in reality that shimmered faintly when no one looked directly at them. The city's pulse wasn't gone. It had diffused, subtle and pervasive. Suddenly, a sound cut through the night, a metallic scraping, low and deliberate. Shadows on nearby walls coalesced, forming shapes vaguely human but grotesquely elongated. They moved unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles, whispering names and fears from Mark, Lena, and Carlos's past. Mark shouted, "Run!" But the street itself seemed to resist, asphalt stretching under their feet, forcing them into a slow, distorted crawl. Lena grabbed his arm, chanting sequences they had memorized from the lattice, trying to push back the creeping distortion. The shapes paused, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Then, as if deciding they were not yet worth attention, they dissolved into smoke. The air snapped back, and the streets returned to normal, or as normal as they could ever be again. Carlos sank to his knees, gasping. "It's not gone. It's everywhere now. Even a small interaction, a thought, it can manifest." Lena nodded grimly. The lattice contained the main anchor, but this is the aftershadows. Remnants, echoes, memories of the city that seeped into the world. They're subtle, but they're here, and they'll grow. Mark looked toward the horizon, where lights of the city twinkled innocently. "We thought we could end it, but maybe the city doesn't end. Maybe we only postpone it." A distant whisper rose on the wind, soft but unmistakable. "Come back." The aftershadows had begun their slow, inexorable spread, and the world, unwitting, was already listening. The sun rose over the city, but it did little to dispel the unease. Streets looked normal, but the air vibrated with a hidden hum, imperceptible yet omnipresent. Mark, Lena, and Carlos walked cautiously. Knowing the aftershadows were not gone, they had only dispersed. Signs of the city's subtle manipulation appeared everywhere. Flickering traffic lights, puddles reflecting impossible skies, and murmurs in the wind that mimicked human voices. Even the birds seemed hesitant to fly, their shadows moving against gravity's pull. Lena touched the lattice fragments they had carried out, now cooled and inert. "It's like holding a heartbeat that isn't yours," she whispered. "The city remembers everything, every fear, every thought. It watches, always." Carlos, scanning the area with advanced sensors, shook his head. "It's learning from us, adapting, even in fragments. The aftershadows influence reality. Any attempt to destroy or ignore them only strengthens the connection." Mark stared at a building across the street. Its windows pulsed faintly, like slow, deliberate breaths. For a moment, he swore he saw shapes moving just inside. Silhouettes of people who had never existed, then blinked, and the illusion vanished. "It's patient," he said. "It doesn't need to scare us all at once. It waits, builds." Now it was calm, almost peaceful, but a faint shimmer hovered just above the cobblestones, a reminder that the city's consciousness was still present, just beneath perception. Lena knelt, placing her hands on the ground. "We can't fight it like a normal enemy. We survive by understanding it, by respecting its rules, but never submitting." Carlos nodded. "We become watchers, not warriors. Observers of a city that watches back." From the corners of their vision, shapes flickered reflections in mirrors that didn't exist, whispers of memories not their own. But the trio no longer ran. They had accepted the new reality. The city's pulse was eternal, its influence pervasive. Humanity would not conquer it, but it could learn to coexist. Mark exhaled slowly, glancing at the horizon. "It's not the end, it's the beginning of knowing how fragile our reality really is." The wind carried the faintest echo of a city's sigh, soft, omnipresent, like the world itself was listening. The aftershadows were here to stay, a silent guardian and predator, weaving themselves into the tapestry of existence. And somewhere, deep in the shifting streets, a faint whisper persisted. "Watch, always watch." The trio walked on, knowing that in the shadows of the city, stories and mysteries would never end. The aftershadows were eternal, and the city had become a living legend, a place that existed both in the world and in the fears, hopes, and imaginations of all who dared to look too closely. The silence of the streets was absolute, but now it was a silence that spoke.